Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I'd like to continue our series on van building by showing you a video that's been a long time in the making. As you may know, I'm converting my Ford Transit into a family adventure slash camper van. This has been a 2+ year process and I'm still not actually done. That being said, one of the first things that I wanted to get working and installed was this kitchen pod and water system that you see in the background. So today I want to show you how I designed and built the system. I'll then show you some of the features and how it operates, and we'll wrap up with some of my thoughts about building your own water systems in vans or RVs. So if that sounds like fun, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you with a van or a small RV, you know that every inch of space is precious, so I spent an inordinate amount of time designing floor plans and layouts in an attempt to meet all of my requirements. So this meant that I needed to consider the kitchen pod in the context of the entire van layout. So as you can see, I settled on a design which placed the kitchen pod behind this second row of permanent passenger seats. So once I knew where I wanted to place the kitchen pod, I then tried to maximize the width of the pod so that I can just barely squeeze in 2 twin mattresses lengthwise. So there's one, and here's the second one. So I tried to make it so you can squeeze those into the rear of the van so I can have a table slash couch slash dinette slash bed. It's kind of a Frankenstein transformer system. If you're interested in these other van systems like the table, the bed, electrical, TV, etc., I've got dedicated videos on those topics. You should be able to reach them by clicking on the card in the upper right of your screen. Okay, so now that you can see where the kitchen pod will eventually end up and how it looks, let's roll back the clock and I'll show you how I designed and built it. So what's the old carpenter's adage? I think it's measure twice and cut once, right? So after measuring the van multiple times, I came up with this design that I was happy with. So for completeness, here are all the relevant dimensions of the kitchen pod. So feel free to pause the video if you want to study the dimensions in detail, but at a high level, I made the kitchen pod exactly fit the width of the allocated space in the van, and then I tried to make the counter height emulate the height of a normal kitchen counter, which is about 36 inches off the ground. And for reasons I'll go into later, I also wanted the sink here to be as large as possible, so I installed this MR Direct 2020 stainless steel sink. So this is an approximate 18-inch by 18-inch by 9-inch deep interior dimensions. So I also didn't want to compromise on a smaller faucet, so I made plans for a full-size kitchen faucet with a removable nozzle as well as a integrated soap dispenser. So if you're interested in either the sink or the faucet, I've actually got separate videos for these units. The blue tank down here is my freshwater tank, and behind it I've actually got space for a separate 5-gallon greywater tank. Alright, so with the physical dimensions planned out, let's turn our attention to the plumbing. Starting over here with the freshwater tank, I use actually a food-grade flexible tubing as the feed tube. So this is the tube that's constantly submerged in the water/tank. So I wanted this to be as clean as possible so it wouldn't leach any chemicals or have any odd taste in the water. So that's what I used. It's submerged here all the time. I then connected this to a 1/2-inch outer diameter clear vinyl tube. And now, since we're talking about these two different types of tubing, now's actually a good time to talk about one of the main challenges of the plumbing portion of this project, and namely that's trying to interface all of these different types of tubes and components to get everything connected together. I'll just say that having a 3D printer here saved my life. All of these orange parts that you see highlighted in the diagram are actually parts that I custom designed and printed. I used a Creality CR10 Mini to print all of these components in PETG. This was a huge time and money saver because I could just simply make all the parts myself at home rather than having to run to the hardware store to buy all these different types of dissimilar adapters and connectors, figuring out they wouldn't fit, going back to the store, etc., etc. I could do all of that rapid prototyping here at home. Okay, so with that being said, let's continue following the flow of the water. So after leaving the freshwater tank, we go through a water filter before we go into a 12-volt water pump, okay? So the output of this pump actually goes to this 3/8-inch compression tee where I split the water. If we follow this lower route first, you'll see that I have this connected to a 3/8 inch iron pipe shutoff valve. Now, this valve can be opened if you want to direct the water through it's basically like a shower hose right here, which then terminates at my, again, another custom 3D printed shower head. Now, the idea is, if you wanted to, you could run this shower to the outside of the van in case you needed a stream of water to, take a shower, hose down a bike, or rinse off a dirty dog, or I guess a dirty kid as well. Now, normally, this valve here is closed, though, because I want to use this for, 99% of the time is actually to direct water to the sink. So to do that, I've basically got the water going to connect to the cold water line of this faucet. So again, remember, this is a normal full-size kitchen faucet, and most people have a hot and a cold line. Well, hot water is a luxury I really don't have space or energy or budget for in the van, so I only connected the cold water line of this faucet to this compression tee, which again is driven by the water pump. So I simply then terminated, or just put a cap on the end of the hot water line. Now, I've seen some people connect both the hot and cold water lines of the faucet to the output of the water pump. So the benefit of that approach is that you'll have running water regardless of the position of the faucet, right? Either if you turn on the hot or the cold side of the faucet, you both get cold water, I guess in this case. The drawback of that approach is that you actually double the amount of tubing that the water has to travel through at this junction, and thereby you increase the internal resistance of the system and therefore reduce the output water pressure. So for this reason, I decided to go with the system you see here. This means that I only get water when the faucet is in the cold position, but I think that's a relatively minor inconvenience, and one that I'm happy to live with. So after the water leaves the faucet, obviously it goes into the sink, where it's connected now to an RV style drain. We'll take a closer look at this drain later, but for now just keep in mind that this is different than the standard U-trap configuration that you would find underneath the sink. And from here we basically directly connect this to the 5-gallon greywater tank. Okay, so this is the plan of attack in terms of the dimensioning of the kitchen pod and the plumbing connections. So let me show you how I actually built it. I built the frame of the pod using simple 2x4s. I've seen some people use fancy 80/20 extruded aluminum for the frame, but I don't have a lot of experience with that material, and 2x4s are much more friendly on the budget. The other benefit of wooden 2x4s is that they're really easy to work with. So as I mentioned earlier, every inch counts, so there were several instances where I needed to rip some of the pieces to squeeze out just an extra inch or so. And this is actually fairly easy to do with a simple table saw. I then pre-drilled some of the screw holes and then screwed the pieces together. This is a frame for the top of the kitchen pod that required some of the thinner pieces because the sink will eventually take up almost all of the interior space. I then started working on the bottom of the kitchen pod. This is actually the toe kick portion, and it needs a little extra work to cut out the sections where your toes go. So I ran a router around the exposed edges so it looks nice and it's smooth. I then put the entire frame together by simply screwing the appropriate pieces together. Also, note that I included some corner braces for additional shear and torsional stiffness. I ended up using a combination of shelf braces and some simpler corner braces for this. With this frame in place, now's a good time to actually do a test fit of the sink, and as you can see, it just plops right in. I then attached the fascia to the rear of the pod, and this was for both aesthetic and structural, namely shear stress reasons. I just used some finishing nails to attach it to the frame. Now, turning our attention to the sink, I marked out the footprint of the sink's lip, and then I used a router to cut out the depth of exactly the thickness of the sink's lip. After a little sanding and cleanup, the net result is that the sink sits nice and flush with the top of the frame. With the sink flush and in place, we can turn our attention to the countertop. Now, I used butcher block as the countertop. So this here is a piece that I got from IKEA. I think it used to be sold under the Hammark countertop name. It's basically a 74-inch by 25 and 5/8 inch by 1 1/18 inch thick solid piece of oak butcher block, and the great thing is I got this from IKEA. I think they were kind of trying to clear their stock of this, so it only cost me $90. So I cut out the appropriate sized piece and then very carefully positioned it on the kitchen pod. So in particular, I need to see where the lip of the sink contacted the countertop. With the contact points marked, I took off the countertop, flipped it over, and used the template that came with the sink to outline the area that needs to be cut out. Now, keep in mind that many sinks have an option to either underset or flush mount this, and it affects how big an area to cut out. Since I want to underset mount my sink, I use the underset mount template. Furthermore, I was very careful when making this cut, as I want to keep this interior piece of butcher block to serve as the sink cover / insert, as I'll show you in a few minutes. So I use a circular saw to make a plunge cut, where I'll eventually cut out a handhold so I can afford a little bit of extra sloppiness here. But then I use a jigsaw to very carefully and precisely cut out the rest of the hole. The end result is that the countertop cutout is just slightly larger than the interior dimension of the sink. So this creates a really small lip around the entire interior of the sink, which can be used to support the cover / insert. I then cut some handholds on the side of the insert and ran a router around the edges to make it smooth. I also ran the same router profile around the inside of the countertop. Next, it was time to drill some holes in the countertop for the faucet and the soap dispenser. I then sanded down all the countertop pieces and wiped them down with towels and some tack cloth. I then finished the butcher block with mineral oil and conditioner. I made a completely separate video showing this process, so if you're interested in that, you can get to it via the card in the upper right of the screen. Now it was time to fasten the sink to the countertop. So I marked the locations where the mechanical clamps would go, and then I flipped the entire countertop upside down. So this is actually a view from underneath, and what I'm showing you here with my finger is the interface between the sink and the bottom of the butcher block countertop. Again, remember, I'm undersetting the sink. This is the area that's actually very likely to get wet, and I don't want any water leaking through this and into the rest of the kitchen pod. So I applied a bead of plumber's caulk around the sink at the interface to protect against water incursion. I also added a bead of heavy-duty construction adhesive a little ways back to really make sure that the sink stayed attached to the butcher block. I then placed the sink in its final location, cleaned up the excess adhesive, and screwed in the mechanical clamps so that I have both a chemical and mechanical connection between the sink and the countertop. While I had the entire assembly flipped over, I added some 90-degree brackets that I'll use to mechanically fasten the countertop to the frame. Once the glue dried, I flipped it right side up and placed it into the frame and screwed it down. Then I just installed the faucet and the soap dispenser. The sink, unfortunately, did not come with an actual drain, so I actually had to install a drain using some plumber's putty. All right, so that was the majority of the construction. I made some finishing touches once I had the kitchen pod installed in the van. Namely, as you can kind of see, I added a fascia to the front and I painted it white. And I've also added this this matching piece of butcher block that goes on as sort of this front face piece, and I'll show you what it does later. Also, I added an electrical switch right here for turning on the water pump, so that's how you basically turn the faucet on and off. I'll show you that also in a second. What else did I do? Oh, I added, as you can see, right, we talked about this earlier, every inch of space in the van counts, right? So everything is laid out nicely. So this is a pretty darn tight fit for the kitchen pod as it's nestled behind the set of passenger seats. So what I did try to do is maximize some of that space. So as you can see, also in the kitchen pod, let me see if I can scoot over and get a slightly better view. I put this rod here, which fits between the the kitchen pod and the seats. So there's toilet paper, there's paper towels back there as well. So this is a holder for both toilet paper and paper towels, as well as I made a small custom kind of very narrow garbage can which slides in between the kitchen pod and the seats. So you can kind of, you know, have a garbage can when you want it, and then when you don't want it, you can just kind of close it up, slide this out of the way. So that's what the kitchen pod looks like. So tell you what, why don't we go ahead and let me open it up and I'll show you what some of the plumbing looks like. All right, so I've removed this front piece so we can get access to the plumbing, and I'll show you what it looks like without any of the greywater or freshwater tanks installed. So here's what it looks like. Here's all my plumbing. As you can see, it's pretty darn simple. I've just mounted all the components to the back wall. So starting over here, you can see this is the freshwater supply tube, right? This is that nice food grade silicone tube that we were talking about. So this is going to go into the freshwater tank, and as you can see, it then goes and follows out to the water filter. And then the filter, it will then flow into the 12-volt pump, and then the 12-volt pump will go up to this valve where I can turn this on or off to basically pick where I'd like to send the water. So one option is I can divert the water to this hose, where I can route this, you know, outside if I need to wash anything or spray anything off, or nominally it can then instead go up to the cold water supply line of the sink, or excuse me, of the faucet. As you can see over here, this is the hot water. The hot water I've just terminated as we discussed earlier. Maybe while we're over here, I'll also point out I actually do carry spares of all the components. So this is a spare 12-volt pump. Surprisingly, this guy has held up very nicely and has been working great for the past 18 months. Yeah, it was a $20 pump. So I figure how can't be that bad to just carry a spare in case you really need it in a pinch. I also carry spares of all the 3D printed fittings, because that was a little bit of an iterative process. It's working well right now, but it took a couple of tries to get the parts designed correctly and manufactured so that they wouldn't leak. I did have a couple of cases where it did leak. I'll talk a little bit about that more later, but right now it's working quite well. In the interest of full disclosure, I mean, I actually did have to, let me see if I zoom into these parts, you can kind of see there's some pipe dope around those threads to help prevent leakage, but otherwise I've been shocked how well the 3D printed parts have been working for these types of fittings. Okay, so then coming down from here's the gray water. This is that RV style drain we were talking about, and as you can see underneath there's no U-trap. It's basically just this straight hose, which then this plugs into the gray water tank, and you'll see that once I install everything. So again, this has worked pretty well. I think one of the reasons why this works so well is that this pressure, the whole system, it's usually not pressurized at all, right? It's only pressurized when you actually turn the system on and are pumping water. So otherwise it's just basically sitting there. So I think that's why these fittings have not failed, is that they're really only pressurized for, you know, a minute at a time. And it's not, you know, super high pressure water in the first place. So, you know what, while we're down here, maybe what I'll do is let me show you how I anchor this to the floor. In fact, you can actually see I am a little bit paranoid about leaks and drip. So I actually do have this rubberized mat that I keep underneath everything in case any of this does end up leaking. It just goes right onto this rubberized mat. And again, this mat is nice because it can just slide in right underneath the toe kick that we designed. So let me pull this up and I'll show you how this is anchored to the floor. All right, so I've got the mat removed and I wanted to show you how I anchor this entire kitchen pod to the floor of the van. So my van, it's a 15-passenger Ford Transit, right? And it's actually fairly easy to remove all of the rear seats. In fact, I made a completely separate video showing the seat removal process and details about that. So if you're interested in that, you can get to it by clicking on the card in the upper right. And if you watch that video, you'll see that underneath a lot of these rear seats, there are these anchor points. So here's one right where there's this big bar, which is where the seat will kind of hook in and grab Okay, so there's actually one right underneath where this bolt is. So this bolt, this is actually nothing more than your standard J-bolt. So really all I do is I take that J-bolt and it's basically just hooking underneath one of these like that, okay? And then as you can see, there's just a nut on top. So I basically just screw that J-bolt tight so it's pulled up against the seat anchor point. So literally this kitchen pod is now anchored in a very similar fashion to how a seat would be anchored. So I'm pretty sure it's not going anywhere. So again, this has been working great for the past 18 months. So I think the proof is in the pudding there. All right, so we'll start by installing the greywater tank. So this is something called a 5-gallon plastic head pack or something like that. It was only like $17. I think people use it for winemaking or home brewing. The one thing that's nice about this is notice how it's shorter than you might expect, and that's really helpful given this small space. Furthermore, remember we talked about this RV style drain earlier, and this is where it comes into play. So you can see if we tried to install a traditional U-trap drain, right, which went down and then came back up in kind of that, you know, U-trap fashion, right, there wouldn't be enough room for this greywater tank. So it works out quite nice in this configuration, having this RV style drain as long, combined with sort of the shorter, lower profile 5-gallon head pack tank. You know, while we're down here, let me show you this. There's this pressure relief valve over here. So this is actually kind of nice because there have been a couple of times where sometimes I need to crack this open a little bit so that the water from the sink will actually drain successfully down into the tank, right? You can imagine if you have this shut and everything else is sealed, you know, it's going to start getting a lot of air pressure if there's a continuous column of water throughout the entire drain. So the way to combat that is just to leave this cracked open a little bit so that some of the air will vent out. Now, that being said, that's also kind of a bit of a negative because this greywater tank can actually smell kind of bad by the time you've got, you know, gray water coming down in here and sitting in here and stewing for a couple of days on a hot summer camping trip, right? This isn't the most pleasant. So having this valve open, you can actually get some of the gases coming out into the cabin, which again doesn't smell the greatest. And again, this is now where the disadvantage of this RV drain comes in, right? If you had a normal U-trap drain, that would create sort of a natural water seal so that the gross, nasty gas from the gray water gets trapped by that U-trap, right? But now with this RV style drain, if this is completely clear water, it's very easy for gas to kind of work its way up and then into just kind of coming out of the sink. So that doesn't smell the greatest. So again, to combat that, basically what I did is I just installed, you know, I have a normal style drain, but this is one of these drains that you can push down completely to seal. So again, now this is completely air and watertight. So no gas is going to be coming out of this. And then if you're just careful and judicious about when you need to crack open this pressure relief valve, you can keep the unpleasant greywater tank smells from escaping the tank and into the cabin. Okay, so let's go ahead and now put in the 5-gallon freshwater right here in front. All right, so now we've got the 5-gallon freshwater tank installed. These are these Scepter 5-gallon jerry can style water tanks. Again, they're about $25 and they work quite well. Again, similar situation. They've got a pressure relief valve here, which again, also I just kind of keep that open so that as I drain the water out of here, the static pressure stays about atmospheric inside the tank. But yeah, it's pretty darn simple. I know. I just kind of strap it down with the strap. I think I forgot to show you actually. I do tie down the greywater tank as well. You can kind of see I just use some paracord up there and down around the bottom, and I tie and attach the greywater tank to the rear of the kitchen pod. And again, sorry, I apologize. This is a little bit hard to see, but you do see I did build some standoffs right here. You see that wood standoff there, and and down there. That way the components like the water filter, I think that's the one that you can kind of see back there, it's protected and you don't have this 5-gallon gray water tank pressing up against it and banging it and fatiguing the 3D printed parts. So this is basically the setup. It's worked quite well, like I said, for the past 18 months. Holds on quite nicely. What else do we want to say about this? I think that's pretty much about it. So at this point, we've got everything hooked in. We can actually flip this on. So I'll just go ahead. Here's the switch, and when I flip it on, you're going to see basically just start sucking water out of the fresh water tank. You'll see this fill up, and it's going to work its way all the way up to the sink. So let's go ahead and ready. I'll flip it on. Okay, and if we give this a second, there you go. There's comes some of the water, and now it's going to make its way up to the faucet, and there we go. We've got running water, right? And this is nice. You only have to wait initially. So that first time when I install it, you saw it took a couple of seconds to get the water from the tank and basically to have the water fill the entire system. But now, if I leave it like this, it's again very nice in the sense that nothing leaks. So there's already water in the tube here and all the way up through the system. So now when I come back up here and I want water again, say the next morning or whenever, you don't have to wait that any time at all. In fact, if I flip this on, you'll see water comes out right away. See? There you go. And again, this faucet is nice because you can detach it and kind of move it around, and actually it's got selections here, so if you don't like solid, you can change this to a sprayer, and yeah, back to the solid. So I'm pretty happy with it. You can see it's got a pretty reasonable volumetric flow rate, so definitely enough to wash hands, wash dishes, things like that. You can hear though it is a little bit loud, so just something to keep in mind. I don't know if there are more quiet water pumps, but okay, in a nutshell, that's what we've got. All right, so now that we've seen how the kitchen pot operates, let's see how it works when I'm actually using it to prepare food. So first thing obviously is let's start washing our hands. So I have an integrated soap dispenser over here, so that makes it really easy to get soap, and then I can just flip this on, and it's easy to wash your hands in this large sink and rinse it off. And then I keep a dish towel just kind of hanging on the side of the pod, so it's easy to go about doing that. Now, let's talk about actually trying to prepare some food. So for our demonstration purposes, I'm just going to cut up a piece of celery. So look at this. I need some area to prepare all of the food. Now, that's why having this insert is so great, because again, this is made out of butcher block. So this is actually like my cutting board sitting here. So I've just got these nice handles that were cut inside of this. So it's easy to just replace this piece to cover up the sink just like this. And now I've got a food prep area. So now you can just sit here, and like I said, since it's your cutting board already, you can just go ahead and do whatever preparation you want on the board. Right? And now let's think about this. So now actually we're a little, you can imagine you can run out of space pretty quickly if you're cooking a large meal or you've got multiple steps. So this is not a ton of space, and also it does block up the sink. So if I want to rinse these vegetables, or if I want to wash hands or use the water again, it's hard to do that with this already stuck in place. So that's where the front fascia piece comes into play. So remember, I know you can't see it, it's a little bit off screen, but we had that front piece of butcher block on as a sort of a fascia to the kitchen pot. So let me pull this off. This thing actually does has multiple jobs. So this has double duty. If you look on the back, what I did is I've mounted these types of little two of them. I don't know what you call these things. I think they're like clasp locks, but basically you see them on like chests or toy boxes or things like that a lot. So they basically, you know, they can pull this thing tight. So I've got one edge of that here on the back of this fascia piece, and then there's the other mating portions on the side underneath of the kitchen pod here. So what I can do is, if I can just, it takes a little bit of finagling to kind of get these things in place, but what I can do is basically attach this front fascia piece right here on the side, and you can see this perfectly lines up. It sits and it rests on top of the cushions of the bench, and this basically extends the work area. And again, this is now also butcher block. which is the same as this. So again, I like the aesthetics that it looks nice, and more importantly, it's functional in the sense that it's easy to just move everything over to the side. So you've got tools, you've got, you know, cups, you've got whatever, you've got basically a lot more area now to prepare on this side, and I can take this out now and use it for whatever I want. So for example, right, rinsing the vegetables, and then we can turn this into the sprayer mode, etc., etc. And then still be able to use the sink and prepare meals as well over here. Now, again, this insert is great because now if I don't need the sink anymore and I even want even more space, so for example, like if we now need to cook something, I'll get the stove out. This sink actually can swing out of the way. So the faucet can swing out of the way, so I can now use this area here for cooking or other food prep. So if I now want to cook up my vegetables, you can easily do that right here. And I know you can't really see it, it's a little bit off screen, but I actually have a hood on top of this so that any humidity or odor or things like that that are generated during the cooking process gets sucked up into this internal overhead exhaust hood. I've actually got a completely separate video on that hood if you're interested. So yeah, I think the workflow for the kitchen pod for food preparation is quite nice. Actually, it works quite well for this purpose. Let me show you one other thing about this front fascia piece, because like we said earlier, everything in the van is doing multiple jobs, and actually this is already doing double duty as the fascia and as this extra table space, but it actually does triple duty. So let me reposition the camera and I'll show you how else I can use this piece. All right, so what that fascia does is I use it when we're converting the rear of the van from table slash living room to a bedroom. So when it's time to go to bed, I want to make this basically into, it effectively turns into a king size mattress with two twins on either side. So the way that happens is this is my standing desk, and it will actually lower. So what I can do is lower this entire desk to go down. And again, if you're more interested in the design of the bed or some of these other subsystems, feel free to check out the dedicated videos on them. But as you can see, this goes down, right? Okay, and now you've got this big gap right here, which I need to fill in. So that's where, again, this part of the kitchen pod, this fascia, comes into play. So I basically have a couple of dowels, metal dowels over here, and they basically just go ahead and insert onto the side. I always have to like try to find the hole. There it is. Oopsies. There, like that. And then this just sits down. So again, this piece of the kitchen pod is doing triple duty. This is its third job, is to basically be used when I'm interested in converting into a bed. So now I can basically slide these two twin mattresses together so to turn this from a couch into a big giant flat bed in the back. So again, the kitchen pod parts are actually pretty versatile. All right, and let me show you another reason why having this big, giant, deep sink is actually really great. So we just got back from a day of skiing, an overnight trip, and as you can see, it looks like a bomb went off in here. Everything's kind of messy, including dog here. But having the sink, what this allows us to do is basically, when you go out for a day, we just throw all of our dirty dishes inside the sink. Don't even bother washing them, because washing them on the road is a little bit of a pain. Especially since we're only out for 1 or 2 nights, we can basically store up all of our dirty dishes here in the sink, and then when we get home, just take them out and run them through the normal dishwasher. So it's just a lot easier than having to do dishes on the road. All right, so I'll show you another part about the kitchen pod that I think is really helpful is, remember we had that hose. So that hose is great for rinsing off if you've got dirty stuff. So I basically diverted the water now to go back through the hose, and it's actually running all the way to the back. So if I just turn off the faucet and then turn on the pump, let's walk to the back. And now you've got water if you've got something dirty. Like for example, I just got back from a bike ride, so I need to rinse off the bike. So having a spray hose is great for this kind of thing. You can clean it off very easily. So it's great for washing off dirty bikes, dogs, kids, all that kind of stuff. The other thing that's great is that it comes all the way back, and you can easily kind of just hook it up somewhere like this if you need to rinse off or rinse off dirty equipment or anything like that. So I think it's pretty versatile to have a little hose attached to the kitchen pod. All right, so 3D printing these parts have been kind of a mixed bag. Again, like I said, I really like the fact that I can design the parts easily and print them out at home without having to run to the hardware store, but it's not perfect. So for example, this part right there, the interface to this iron pipe shutoff valve, that part actually has turned out to crack a little bit. So for example, you can see if I turn on the water right now, whoops, there we go. Yep, that's leaking. So I'm gonna have to redesign that part, thicken it up a little bit, and try it again. All right, so let me show you one issue I sometimes encounter with the kitchen pod. So I'm actually up here in the mountains doing some winter camping, and it got to about 25 degrees last night. And as you can kind of see here, it is it's frozen. I'm warming up the van, so this is starting to melt a little bit, but if you can see, this whole thing is, there's ice coming off of it. This is frozen, so the faucet lever is frozen, and long story short, if I try to turn this on, you hear that? You get nothing. So the pipes have frozen right now. So this is one issue that if you're out here and it's really cold, I do have an issue because the pipes are not insulated or heated, and neither is the faucet. So again, something to think about. All right, so while we've got the front fascia off, let's also talk about this. One other thing that I learned is that I'm actually really glad that I made this kitchen pod as big as possible. It's one of those situations where I think you always run into where you never wish you had less space. You always seem to wish you had more space. So for example, just looking at it down here, look, I can barely fit in the gray water, the fresh water, and then there's just barely enough room kind of here on the side for me to maybe right here I actually have the hose for my solar shower and a small little brush. That's all the space that is back here. So definitely I would recommend making this as big as possible. The other thing, while we're talking about big, you know, it's only 5 gallons of fresh water and 5 gallons of gray water. So obviously you want the gray and the fresh water tanks to be the same size and be matched, but 5 gallons of water, I've discovered, surprisingly goes quick when you've got a family of 4 running out in the summer, washing hands, cooking, doing whatever. So this about lasts us, you know, for 2 days and 1 night. That's pretty much what this will do, and we seem to go through 5 gallons of water pretty quickly. So that's one reason actually I ended up building a solar shower so I can offload some of that water requirements to a 6-gallon solar shower I carry on the roof, as well as carry extra water in case you need it. So again, it's one of those things, I'm glad I went as big as possible, but even more than 5 gallons in the future would be nice. While we're staring at this down here, while we're talking about water capacity, one other thing I would do differently in the future is I would make this freshwater tank a little less opaque. I mean, blue is nice and makes it seem that this is great for fresh water. And I mean, I don't know if you can read that very easily, but it says, you know, there's a line on the side of it right there, right? This says approximately 5 gallons up there. Now, the problem is, that's great that it lists that, but I can't see the water level in this completely opaque container. So I really don't know the state of the water level in the freshwater tank. The reason I learn is when I try to turn on the faucet and there's no water. So in the future, I would have this maybe be a clear plastic similar to the 5-gallon tank. But even the 5-gallon tank is a little bit difficult because you can see I have to take off the entire fascia and then it's tucked behind. So if you look down at the bottom, let's look. So you can kind of see, let me see, there you go, right? So you can definitely see the level of the water in the gray water tank, right? So this is my rough indication. If I can glance back there and see that the gray water tank is getting pretty full, I probably know that the fresh water tank is almost out as well. But in the future, maybe the better design would be to swap locations. So to put the fresh water in the back and then to put the gray water in the front so that you can easily see the state of the water at any given time. But again, something to think about. All right, another thing that I would do differently in the future if I did this again is notice I put the soap dispenser on sort of this side of the kitchen pod, right? I thought the logic was I wanted to keep it over here so that I would have a lot of space over here to store other stuff, like just extra counter space, and the soap dispenser would be out of the way. Well, turns out in practice that's almost the exact opposite of what you want. Because we've got small kids, this kitchen pod it's a little bit too tall for them to reach that soap dispenser when they're just standing here. So what they end up having to do is climb up on this bench, and then they're able to wash their hands easily. However, again, the problem is now the soap dispenser is on the wrong side of the kitchen pod. It would be so much easier for the kids if the soap dispenser was right here, because that way they could basically help themselves, right? They could get their soap, they can hit the switch, they can rinse their hands, and they could do everything by themselves here. But now this basically takes an adult to help them wash their hands because I put the soap dispenser on the wrong side. So something you might want to think about. While I'm talking about resting stuff on the counter, let me show you. So one of the things that I did early is, we showed earlier how I can use this space right here for cooking. So I had the stove there, right? So what I did was I had a propane canister sitting right there, hooked up to the stove, and I was cooking along and everything went great and hunky-dory. Well, what happens with these propane canisters, right, is for any people that have used them, is that they build up condensation and moisture on the exterior of the can. And if you have some of the older, like these are nicer cans, these are the refillable ones, but I was using one of those junky disposable ones, and it was a little bit old, it was a little bit rusted on the bottom, but for whatever reason it creates this like ring, right? There's like all this gunk or rust or whatever that came down, sat and overnight on the butcher block. And even though this thing is sealed, look at this. This is horrible. This is stained in. I haven't been able to get this out. So that was a big mistake, something that I learned. So now what I did is I ended up 3D printing myself a little coaster. So now if I have a propane canister, I just stick it on top of the coaster to hopefully try to combat that problem. So something that I learned a little bit the hard way. One thing I'm really glad I did was actually put in the toe kick. So you remember that I have a little toe kick underneath the sink. The original intention for that was so that obviously I could nestle my toes under there while I'm standing at the sink and preparing food or whatnot. And it kind of works for that. It's pretty good. But actually, it turns out the major benefit of this is it allows me to now throw in this mat. I can now slide this mat all the way under the kitchen pod and have the water tank sitting on top of this waterproof rubber mat. So now I don't have to worry about leaks as much. So having this toe kick, my original goal was obviously to make it more comfortable to stand, but it's almost more important is that it allows me to put in this continuous rubberized floor mat to allay my fears and paranoia about leaking components getting on the van floor. So that has been a great help. Okay, and lastly, the one other thing I wanted to leave you with, if you're thinking about designing your own kitchen pod, is I've actually made this. If you remember, this thing is attached to the floor using those J-hooks like we showed earlier, meaning that this entire kitchen pod is actually removable. So just by loosening those I have two J-bolts that latch this thing on the floor. If you just remove those, this entire kitchen pod can come out of the van. In fact, all of my componentry, my benches, my tables, the bed, everything back here in the rear of the van is completely removable. So this is not a permanent camper setup. If I need to convert this back into a 15-passenger people mover, I totally can do that. The kitchen pod will just pop right out, as will all of the other stuff. So I would recommend, if you've got the ability to make this modular, give it the ability to be in or be out. It's very useful. That being said, this has pretty much stayed in here probably around for a year straight, especially since it's kind of during the pandemic. So having running water has been absolutely life-saving and game-changing for our ability to kind of get out just in general, and especially during the pandemic. So you're able to be completely self-contained. You can wash hands here, you can prepare food, you can do whatever you want, all within the confines of the van and be 100% self-contained. So again, the reason why I wanted to get this kitchen pod running, it's one of the first things that I completed in the van, was because it enables so much functionality, right? Just having running water is absolutely critical for excursions or camping or other kind of adventures. All right, so here we are at the end of the video. So let's just talk about the nitty-gritty, namely how much did this all cost and how long did it take me to put together. So here's a list of pretty much all of the materials that I purchased to build this kitchen pod. Obviously, there are some big ticket items like the sink there was over $100. The faucet was about $80 at Costco. I found that was actually a pretty darn good deal. And then the butcher block countertop from IKEA was, again, about $90. So, put all these together with tax, and actually, those three big ticket items are about $300. And then, surprisingly, if you start throwing in all these little nickel and diming for the little pieces, like the freshwater can, the greywater tank, all that other stuff, I was actually kind of surprised that overall, it was almost $600 of just raw materials and components that went into this kitchen pod. So that number definitely came in a little bit higher than I was expecting, especially since I made everything from scratch pretty much from the ground up. I mean, obviously I bought all these components, but I put everything together myself. So, I guess it is what it is, right? Nothing I can do about it. I still think I would do this if I were to go back and redo it. I'd obviously make some changes, but I guess $600 is about what it costs to have that type of functionality. Now, in terms of construction time and design time and all this other research time, pretty much what I discovered is after tallying it all up, it was about 65 hours of work. So, again, it was more work than I expected, but I guess that seems to be the case with all of my projects. I go into it being all optimistic, thinking I'm going to be able to do it cheaply and quickly, and the costs start ballooning, and the hours involved also start ballooning, and usually I'm pretty happy to be done with the project at the end of it. So, long story short, here's where it came out to: about 65 hours of work and about $600 of materials. But again, like I said, it's been a really great item to have in the van, and it basically enables all sorts of other functionality and adventures by just having running water and the ability to kind of wash dishes or rinse off equipment, or basically just have fresh water readily accessible is just an absolute game changer. So again, I don't think I would change too much about it other than the things we've already talked about in this video. But here's kind of what I discovered it cost me in terms of time and money. All right, so there you have it. That's the kitchen pod that I built and installed in my van, and as you can see, it's worked great. It's helped do a lot of camping in all seasons, summer, or as you can kind of see here, winter. So with that being said, I think this is probably a great spot to leave it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if so, I also hope you consider subscribing to the channel. Surprisingly, if you just scroll a little ways down there, click on that subscribe button, it really does help me continue to make these videos. And remember, the new videos come out every Monday, so I hope I'll catch you at one of these future discussions and we can all learn something new together. So until then, I think I'm going to sign off. Talk to you later. Bye.